Have you ever noticed how, just when everything around you is silent, your mind decides to speak louder? It's not just any thought. It's a continuous, almost invasive flow that seems to respect no rest, pause, or intention. You close your eyes seeking calm, but find noise instead. And perhaps on some level, this has already made you believe that there is something wrong with you. This is the silent conflict that almost no one explains. The more you try to control your mind, the more it rebels. But calm down. The story doesn't begin where you imagine, and it definitely doesn't end where you were told. The problem was never an excess of thoughts. The problem was how you were taught to look at them. From an early age, we learn that a tranquil mind is an empty, silent, still mind. An almost spiritual, aesthetic, minimalist ideal was created that inner peace means a total absence of thought. And when that doesn't happen, because it almost never does, psychological frustration arises. Conscious guilt, the practical feeling of inner failure. But what if the mind wasn't wrong? What if it was just being the mind? The human mind wasn't designed to stop. It didn't emerge to contemplate nothingness, but to anticipate dangers, compare scenarios, and protect its existence. Constant thinking isn't a psychological error, nor necessarily pathological anxiety. At its most primitive and functional root, thinking is automatic survival. It's an active, vigilant system, attentive to what could go wrong even before it does. What we call mental overthinking today was, in another time, precisely what kept humanity alive. There is something profoundly philosophical and almost poetic in this. The mind does not rest because it believes that if it stops, something might escape. It calculates, revisits the past, projects the future, constructs narratives. It does not stop because it has been conditioned to avoid emptiness, not to inhabit it. And the modern error was to transform this natural mechanism into an internal enemy. We began to fight against the very functioning of consciousness as if it were defective for fulfilling its function well. Perhaps that's why so many people feel tired for no apparent reason. It's not the thought itself that's exhausting, but the silent war against it. The more you try to expel an idea, the more strength it gains. The more you get irritated with your own mind, the more it defends itself. The result is a draining psychological cycle. Internal struggle, resistance, constant tension. And in the end, a feeling of inadequacy, as if you weren't even able to control what's happening inside you. There's a simple, almost minimalist phrase that reveals much more than it seems. Wanting to stop the mind is like asking the heart to stop beating. Yet, we persist. We force silence. We seek miraculous techniques. We try to silence thought, as if trying to close the sea with our hands. And when it doesn't work, we blame ourselves. But no one told us that perhaps the conscious path isn't to stop, but to understand. If you observe honestly, you'll realize that the mind doesn't create suffering on its own. Suffering arises when you become confused by every thought, when you believe that everything that arises in consciousness is absolute truth. This detail changes everything, but not yet. Before getting there, it's necessary to look more deeply at this internal noise that seems never to cease, because understanding why the mind never stops is only the surface. What really matters is discovering what happens when you stop fighting it. And that's exactly where the next part begins. True mental suffering begins at a very specific point that almost no one observes clearly. It's not when the thought arises, nor when the mind races, nor when silence disappears. Suffering begins the instant you become confused by what you are thinking. That's when the psychological experience becomes heavy, when consciousness loses ground, and when the internal noise ceases to be merely a natural movement, becoming an invisible prison. Thinking, in itself, doesn't hurt. What hurts is believing that each thought defines who you are, what you are worth, and where your life is going. You don't suffer because you overthink. You suffer because you treat every thought as a fact, as a sentence, as an identity. The mind throws out phrases all the time, many of them automatic, inherited, conditioned, repeated without question. Yet, you listen as if it were absolute truth. When an idea arises saying that you are not enough, that you are behind, that you have failed, that things could have been different, something inside you tightens, not because of the thought itself, but because you enter into it, dwell in it, construct an entire narrative from a single mental event. This is a crucial point for conscious self-awareness. Thoughts are psychological events, not universal truths. They appear, move, and disappear, just like sounds, images, or bodily sensations. The difference is that thought speaks to you using its own voice, and this creates a subtle trap. Because it seems intimate, familiar, and logical, you believe it. But the mind speaks, and that doesn't mean it is you. There is something quieter, more stable, more present, observing all of this happening. Think practically and honestly. If a thought arises saying, "You are not enough," where exactly is that written? In what concrete place does this truth exist? If you observe carefully, you realize it's just an internal sound, a phrase passing through your consciousness. It has no physical weight, no form, no permanence. Yet, when you identify with it, the body reacts, the emotions contract, the energy shuts down. That's when suffering sets in, not because the thought is powerful, but because you merge with it. The shift in consciousness happens when you realize that mental freedom is not absolute silence. It's not about erasing the mind, nor about achieving a permanent state of aesthetic and idealized peace. Freedom is space. Space between you and what passes through your mind. It's the psychological and philosophical capacity to observe without confusion, to listen without obeying, to perceive without reacting automatically. In this space, something changes. The mind continues to speak, but it no longer commands. Thought appears, but it doesn't define. There's an almost Zen-like quality to this process. When you stop chasing your mind, something begins to calm down on its own. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped resisting. The mind will never stop, and perhaps it doesn't even need to. What can stop is this constant pursuit, this exhausting attempt to control everything internally. When observation replaces the struggle, a subtle, practical, real lightness emerges, applicable to everyday human experience. Perhaps this understanding is starting to make sense now. If so, comment here with words like observation, space, or the phrase, "I am not my thoughts." I want to know what went through your mind while you were listening to this.